you acknowledge that you know you're being recorded?
Okay, yeah, this is Sheldon Fielman, and I know I'm being recorded, video and audio.
There you go.
And it's okay.
What was your job on March 30th, 1981, on the day an attempt was made on President Reagan's life?
Okay, let me tell you how it started. I came in that day, and they told me that my partner, my audio person, was off that day. And the first thing they did was give me another audio person straight out of the studio who had never been outside in his whole life. But he wanted to be outside. He wanted to be an outside audio man. And they said, you got an easy job. You got to go down to the Washington Hilton, and the president's going to come in and make some speeches. You'll stay outside, just get his arrival, and wait for him to leave, get his departure, and then you'll be free to go to lunch. So I says, okay, that sounds good, even though it was sort of a drizzly, rainy day, and it was a miserable day. And my partner's name that day was Steve Caraway. And he come over to me and he says, I guess I'm working with you today, and can you show me the ropes? I says, yeah. And he said, well, what are we doing? I says, well, we just got to get the president coming in, get the president going out. I said, my words were, it's a piece of cake. Then we'll go get some Mexican food for lunch. Well, we got down there, and the unusual thing that day is Secret Service put up one rope line for everybody, the press, anybody who wanted to come in and see the President Reagan come in. Usually they put up two rope lines. This particular day, they put up one rope line. Well, I took my position about 2 feet from the wall of the hotel, so that when the president came in down the driveway, I would have the longest shot of him walking into the entrance. And that was my job for the day. Get him coming in, get him going out.
Sounded like a really simple job.
Yeah?
So what were you doing when the shooting actually happened?
All right, now the president came in, and everything was fine. He went into the hotel, and we stood there and we waited for him to come out. Well, unbeknownst by myself, there was a guy standing next to me, right next to me, and it wasn't my partner. But he was quiet, and I paid him no attention. Now, the wall, like I say, I was like 2 feet from the wall of the hotel, so he was right next to me. And so we're standing there, and the president is coming out. The president starts to walk out. He gets up to the car, and all heck broke loose. The officer, the police officer who was standing in front of us, who actually, if he was looking the right way, would have seen the assailant Hinckley, turned around to look at the president. He was the first one shot. Then the press secretary, he was the next one shot. And then, of course, the Secret Service agent who was guarding the president jumped in front of the president, grabbed his chest, and he went down. And then the other Secret Service agent doubled the president up and threw him into the car. At that time, none of us knew if the president was shot. Actually, we thought he was okay. My first reaction on this thing when it started, on the first shot, the camera is on my right shoulder. And you know these cameras are large. So that's my blind side. I don't know who's standing next to me on my right because I can't see them. But I knew on the first shot that whoever was there was very close. There was no room between me and the wall. So if you look at any of these assassination attempt pictures, you see this little jerk up, just a little pop up. My arm the reflexes just popped the camera up an inch or two. And then I locked in on what I had to do. Now, what was I thinking when this is all happening? You got to remember that Hinckley unloaded this gun in like 3 seconds. Count off 3 seconds. It's very quick. He had 6 shots off in 3 seconds. You don't have time to think. The only thing that I knew standing there, I wasn't hit. So I'm going to stand here. I'm not going to move too far. Some of the other people from the other networks hit the ground on the first shot. By the time they got up, even if it was only 1 second, they've lost pictures. I stayed where I was until I saw the president being pushed into the car. Once the president was pushed into the car, I took 1 step out and then turned quickly to my right and widened that lens out as far as I can go. And then you saw Hinckley holding the gun, 2 hands, and you saw his arms holding the gun. And then all heck broke loose. People jumped him. There was a spectator who was inside who was the first one to jump him. And Secret Service agent who I knew told me afterward, he said, "You know, Shelley," he says, "you saved Hinckley's life." And I says, "How did I do that?" When I stepped that 1 step out, he was ready to shoot him. And I stepped out and he held his fire. And you see him in my pictures coming through the air like Superman, flying. And he hit Hinckley, and he actually hurt himself because he jammed his neck when he hit the wall. So that was how it started. They got president into the car, the motorcade sped off, and then later on, of course, we heard that they took him to the hospital because he was shot. I made some pictures of people laying on the ground. The officer, you see his hat is laying in one place, and he's laying down. He was shot in the shoulder. The press secretary, that was another story. There was one of the staff people was kneeling by him, and he was calling for a handkerchief to try to stop the blood from coming out of his head. And with one hand, I'm still shooting. I have the camera on my shoulder, and I'm still shooting. I handed him my handkerchief. And at that time, I really thought the press secretary was dead. But it changed his life drastically, but he made it. He lived through it, even though it changed his life drastically. He was very outdoorsy, and now he was confined to a wheelchair. His speech was bad. There was a whole bunch of things. So we did this afterward. Got the ambulances, took everybody away. I did some pictures of the FBI being there looking for the bullets, the shells. There was a woman who I remember came running across the street, screaming her head off, yelling, my husband, my husband. Evidently, she worked across the street, and the husband was Jerry Parr. He was the president's Secret Service agent, not the one that was shot, but the one that pushed the president into the car, and she thought he was shot. So we did all of that. And then everybody left, and my partner hadn't said a word. He did a very good job. It was his first day out. He did an excellent job, because at that time, in history, we had the camera, the tape machine was separate from the camera. So we were hooked up by cable. And if he had pulled that cable tight, I could have lost whatever I was shooting. He could have broke the cable or popped my eye. And he did a great job. He got sound and everything. The aftermath thing with Steve, is my partner, when this was all over, of course we never got our Mexican food. When this was all over, Steve said to me, "Thank you for the day. I enjoyed it, but I'm going back inside and I'm never coming out again." And that's what he did. He retired a couple of years back, and he never came back out again. Me? Well, we went inside the hotel, and I sat down, and now the adrenaline was dying off. And as I sat down, my left leg just started going up and down. It was jumping up and down.
Right head move. You gave
And-
yourself away.
Hold on a minute. Got some noise here. Yeah, we went inside and I sat down and my left leg started going up and down, up and down. And it was embarrassing. And I'm leaning on it, trying to stop it from going up and down. It was nerves. It was nerves, and it went away, of course. But it was nerves, and that was my reaction. And then for a good while after that shooting, when I went to sleep at night, I saw in my dreams I saw the press secretary bleeding out there on the ground. And it took a good year or so before I would stop thinking about that. And that's, it's not the first time I've been involved with somebody shot or with death. Because I spent a little time in Nam, but this really got to me. But eventually it wears off. And you just put it aside. And that was my day, the 30th, 1981. And
When the shooting started, did you realize that it was gunshots?
on the first shot, if you look at this, if you get a copy of this film or tape, I think the History Channel keeps playing it. You'll see the reaction was a quick movement of my arm, a jerk up like an inch, a pop, and then I locked down and sight in on the president. I know at that time I got to stay with the president. As much as I'd want to get a good picture of Hinckley, I had to stay with the president. I did get to see Hinckley, though. When all these people jumped on top of him, it was like a pyramid. And there was a hole in this pyramid. And I zoomed into this hole, and here's this face looking at me. It with bright eyes, big eyes, just staring out at me. And it was a pretty good picture of Hinckley. In fact, it was good enough that the next day I was staked out at the Washington Hospital, looking to see what VIPs were going to come visit the president. And these two guys showed up, two suits showed up and said, "Are you Sheldon Fielman?" And I said, "Yes." They showed me their credentials. They were with the FBI. "We'd like to see if you can identify the assailant." And they had a book, and they opened up the book, and there was a bunch of pictures in the book. And I started going through it, and all of a sudden I says, "This is him right here." And I says, "But you guys colored his hair black, and he had light hair." And the FBI guys didn't say a word, did a little slight smile. And they said, "Thank you very much," and they walked away. About 20 minutes later, another guy showed up and said, "Sheldon Fielman?" And I said, "Yes." And he handed me a summons to appear in court as a witness. So I actually had to go to court and sat there, and then I was asked, "Can you identify the assailant? Is he in the courtroom?" And I pointed over at Hinckley, who was sitting there with his lawyers, and he glared at me like it was a very weird look. And it was hard to explain. He was just glaring at. He glared at everybody. When he was found guilty by reason of insanity, yes, I realized he was Looney Tunes. I mean, because the reason he shot the president was to get notoriety. He was in love with the actress. So, yes, I agreed with the verdict. They couldn't do anything else.
What are some of the changes you have seen while covering the president because of this event?
Okay, now it used to be, for instance, at the Hilton Hotel, it was an open driveway. You would have to get out of the car and walk maybe 30 feet to a door, which they took them into the hotel. And that was most of the hotels. The Mayflower Hotel here in Washington, hotels out of town. It was, they'd come close and then they'd get out of the car and walk into the place. Buildings, any building or any. After that happened, a lot of the hotels built garages special for the VIPs. The Hilton did, other hotels did. The Mayflower Hotel here in Washington puts up, every time the president goes, a huge tent that's like a garage, and the car drives into this tent so you can't see when the president gets out of the car. In any other city, if they don't have a garage, they do that with the tent. So the main change was you cannot see the president exiting or entering or exiting a building anymore. It's strictly covered by garage or by a tent. In fact, today I had to cover President Obama at a hotel here in Washington. And they drove up to the loading dock entrance, which is covered. And the president gets out when the Secret Service say get out, and he walked in the back way. But he didn't come. There was no place the public could see him coming into the hotel. And of course I was inside, so I didn't see him leaving, but I'm sure it was right the same way.
How many other presidents have you covered, and what was your first day of work like?
My first day at work. It's a long time ago. You weren't even a dream yet. It was November the 22nd, 1963. That number ring a bell to you? Kennedy. I was sitting here in Washington, D.C., and I was just a little kid. I was about 15 years old or something like that. No, I was young. I just started. That was my first day. I was sitting in a restaurant with two guys, and they were telling me, well, it's a Friday, and we were motion picture film. We weren't videotape. They told me it's a Friday, and you're going to be going home early. Probably around 1 o'clock we'll go home. And I said, that's great. All of a sudden in the restaurant, they put the TV on, and it was announced that President Kennedy was shot. These two guys jumped up and they left me. Now, in those days at NBC, we had no radios, we had no telephones. Of course, there was no such thing as a cell phone. We had no radios. All we had was pages, and they hadn't given me one yet. So I went to the telephone and I called the office and I says, "Hi, this is Sheldon Fielman, and I just started work today. What would you like me to do?" Well, this harried voice said, "National Airport, American Airlines, somebody will meet you." Okay. They didn't say where I was going. And it was a Friday, and we had some guests coming over for dinner. So a courier shows up. I got to National Airport. A courier shows up, hands me a lot of money and airplane tickets for Dallas, told me what I was going to be, who I was going to be meeting, and he gave me a tape machine. And it was a tape machine called a Nagra Kadulski. And it's a tape machine used in film for syncing sound to the picture. I had never seen one in my life. This thing was all written in German. And he handed me that and a microphone and was getting ready to get on a plane for Dallas. Well, I called my wife before I left, and I says, "Listen, I'm going to be late for dinner." And she says, "Well, how late?" And I says, "Looks like about 5 days." And there I was, heading for Dallas. I met a cameraman there, and our job was to walk around Dallas and just make some side pictures, like what they call cutaways. Show the school, the book depository, the route the president took, and things like that. That was the first day. That was the day that the president was actually shot. Day 2, we did more of that. Day 3, we were, all the press, which was a small group, were invited to the basement of the jail because they were going to bring Oswald out, transport him. And it was a group of maybe 20 reporters, and NBC had these big studio cameras there, but we were just to make side pictures. So we stood there in the garage, and then the sheriff brought out Oswald, and we all made like a semicircle, formed around, and I was towards the left of this semicircle. I had a little microphone, and I was trying to get this microphone over people because they were yelling questions at Oswald. And Ruby came from the other side, and bang, 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 and Oswald went down, and that was the end of that. We all backed up. And I was beginning to think at that time, I said, wow, what business is this that I'm in? Well, so that was my third day. The first day, second day, that was my actual third day on the job. That's how this business started. Then I spent 2 months in Vietnam. Went on a few little missions with the Americal Division, and we did some of that. And then we had a lot of work in those days. We had civil rights. I went through all civil rights marches. And
You said you covered the civil rights movement. Do you have any stories from that time period, and what changes have you seen?
we traveled all through the South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. And a lot of places we were chased out of because they didn't like the press. And we were invited, NBC, I should say, was invited to cover a very large KKK rally, a Ku Klux Klan rally. And this rally was in a place called Americus, Georgia. And we had a full crew, audio, camera, lighting. We had a correspondent. We had a producer. We flew into Albany, Georgia, and which was 15 miles from Americus. We rented a car, and we drove to Americus, and we stayed. Hold on a minute. Okay. We stayed, we drove to Americus, and we stayed in a Best Western motel. And the next day was going to be this rally. Well, we got up early in the morning, and we went to this little restaurant that was attached to the motel. And we sat down at a table, and this woman came over, and she had on a white apron. It was really dirty. And she looked at us and she says, y'all with the press? And we said, yes, ma'am, we're with NBC News. And she looked at us and she says, well, you get your asses out of here. I don't serve white trash. She threw us out. Well, we left and we went to cover our rally. We didn't eat that morning. We went to cover our KKK rally, and we set up. And the rally started getting nasty towards the press. And the big KKK guy that invited us to come to this rally came back to us and said, take what you can take and get out of here fast, because they're turning against y'all. Well, we grabbed the camera and the sound gear. We left the microphone and the cable and all that stuff. We got back to our car. They had broken every piece of glass in the car and flattened all 4 tires. And we had a 20-mile drive back to the airport. And they were coming. Well, we got into this car, and we drove without tires, sending up sparks 30 feet high. We thought we were going to blow up. And we drove that car back to the Hertz lot at the airport. And went inside, and the Hertz lady said, everything all right? We said, everything's just fine. She says, where's the car? We said, out in your lot. Okay, and we got in the plane and came home. Well, now a good few years passed, and there was a guy running for president by the name of Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter lived in the Plains, Georgia. But the Plains, Georgia didn't have any hotels, so we had to go to the nearest hotel, which was Americus, Georgia, 15 miles away. And we stayed at the Best Western Hotel. And that morning, we got up, a bunch of us, went into the restaurant, sat down, and I'll be darned if the same woman with that same dirty apron didn't come over to serve us. And she looks at us, and I'm getting ready to stand up and walk out. I figured she's going to throw us out. And then she says, you boys down here covering Jimmy? Yes, ma'am. Well, you're certainly welcome. And I looked at her and I says, ma'am, I says, you don't really remember me. But a few years back, I said, I sat down, you said you don't serve Yankee press trash in here, and you threw us out. And she looked at me, she said, well, Sonny, times change. So that was an experience. That was covering a president. I've covered the presidents now. I'm not going to count Kennedy because I started with Lyndon Johnson. So you have Lyndon Johnson. Well, I started with Lyndon Johnson, and we've gone right on through. And I'm reminded of a story when we used to go down to Austin, Texas to cover Lyndon Johnson when he used to go home. We used to stay in Austin. He was about 70 miles from Austin. And he invited the whole press corps out to his ranch for a barbecue. And so we went out there, and he had this split rail fence all around his house. Fairly new fence. And so I was having a beer, and I sat on the fence, and his doctor at that time joined me with a beer, and he sat on the fence with me. His doctor at that time was an admiral in the Navy. And all of a sudden I hear this drawl, you get your asses off my fence. The Navy admiral jumped off the damn fence. Well, I guess I was too young and dumb and dumbfounded. So I sat there on the fence. And he came right up in front of me and said, boy, he says, how would you like to go into the Army? And I says, no, sir. He says, well, then you get your ass off my fence. And I got off his fence. So there were a couple of funny things, and he used to also, he didn't care for the press much. And in those days when he signed an important bill, it was a plastic pen that you had to dip in ink, and it looked like an old-fashioned feather quill. And you had to dip it in ink, and he signed just a little bit, and then he'd give it to somebody, take another one and sign a little bit and give it to somebody else. It was like a souvenir of that particular bill. But he always had a bunch of pens left over. And he used to look at the press, and thank God I guess we learned the hard way. He used to throw it at us like a dart. So the first time he did that, we all caught on. So when we'd go out to cover something like that of him, we'd all carry a newspaper or a magazine so that when these things came at you like a dart, you could swat it out of I got 4 pens. And the reason why he kept throwing them at me, because another dumb thing I did was, we had to shoot for the Red Cross a promo with the president. And we lit it and set up and everything, and he came in and he looked at me and he says, are you going to get my good side? And I looked back at him and I says, which side is that, Mr. President? And his remark was, smart ass. So when he gave out the pens, he aimed for me if I was there. So, and that was a couple of little funny things, but we had,
What do you think I got?
there was a lot of, my favorite president, I think, well, I liked Jerry Ford. He was a regular guy, and I liked Jerry Ford. And he wasn't a bad president. The press picked on him a lot. Bill Clinton, I think he did a pretty good job too, but he got picked on for other reasons. So there's been a bunch of presidents, and I think, like I said, my favorite was Jerry Ford, and President Obama seems to be doing a good job. I'm not traveling in the White House that much anymore, so I don't come in contact with him like the other guys.
Are you still working?
What?
I'm still working. It's been 40-some odd years, I think 46, I think. And I enjoy seeing people like your father and other friends that I have. I enjoy coming in and talking to them and going out. Of course, nowadays when I come in, the first thing I do is go up to the desk and say, hey, I want to be off on time. And sometimes it happens, and sometimes it doesn't. And so that's a brief synopsis of 46 years, Katie. Vietnam was in there. I covered the first Gulf War. I went over to Saudi Arabia and into Kuwait. But those days are gone. That's for a younger person. And now I just like doing quiet things.
Quiet things. You had enough big events for now.
That's about it. There's your history.
Yeah, well, thanks for sitting down and doing this interview with me.
Huh?
Thanks for sitting down and doing this interview
Oh,
with
you're
me.
very welcome. You're very welcome. I hope it works out for you.
Give her an A.
I'll give you an A, yeah. Call your professor. We'll tell him you get an A.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
You take care.